This is a story about the woman who dressed grief itself. Elizabeth Keckley was born enslaved in Virginia, early 19th century, a child taught pain before language. History remembers her as a talented seamstress, a confidant to Mary Todd Lincoln, a survivor who stitched her way into the White House. That is the version taught in textbooks. But there is another version, a quieter one. It lives in marginal notes, sealed church minutes, and letters never mailed. A version whispered by archivists who refused to sign their names. A version that suggests Elizabeth Keckley did not merely witness American power. She learned how it hid its rot. In the years before the Civil War, Washington, D.C. was not just a capital. It was a corridor between slavery and freedom, faith and silence, confession and erasure. Churches doubled as counting houses. Orphanages doubled as laundries. And women like Keckley moved between these spaces unseen, carrying secrets sewn into hems. Elizabeth learned early that cloth was safer than paper. Paper could be burned, but thread endured. For 50 years, she never spoke of what she saw in the rooms behind the rooms, what she heard behind prayer doors, what she was asked to alter, not only garments, but evidence. After her death, a locked trunk was discovered. Inside, no diary, no confession, only dresses, and one unfinished seam. Red thread knotted, then cut short, as if the story had been stopped mid-sentence. The question historians avoid is simple. Why would a woman trusted with the First Lady's body choose silence for half a century? Elizabeth Hobbs was born into ownership. Her earliest memories were not of faces, but of rules: when to lower her eyes, how to hold her hands, how not to react when struck. Her mother was enslaved. Her father, history suggests, was also her owner. This was not uncommon. What was uncommon was what followed. Her earliest memories were not of faces, but of rules: when to lower her eyes, how to hold her hands, how not to react when struck. Her mother was enslaved. Her father, history suggests, was also her owner. This was not uncommon. What was uncommon was what followed. At the age of 4, Elizabeth was loaned to another household, a practice known as training. The word hides cruelty. Children were beaten not for disobedience, but for hesitation. Pain was instruction. Silence was survival. She was whipped publicly as an example. But there is an account, disputed, half erased, that suggests Elizabeth was punished inside a church vestry, behind the pulpit, where hymns drowned out screaming. If true, it would explain her later refusal to enter churches alone, even as a free woman, even as a respected guest. Trauma, when sanctified, becomes doctrine. By adolescence, Elizabeth had learned sewing, first as punishment, then as protection. Needlework kept her indoors, close to women, close to secrets spoken while being fitted. Clothing is intimate. It hears everything. She learned how wealthy white women spoke when men were gone, how they justified cruelty as order, how prayer was used to cleanse intent rather than action. Elizabeth was raped by a man who believed ownership excused desire. She bore a son who was sold away. Official records call it separation. She called it burial without a body. Something in her changed then. Witnesses later described her as composed, unnervingly so, not cold, contained, as if she had learned to fold grief into manageable shapes. She did not scream. She watched. And watching, she learned the architecture of power, where it bent, where it cracked, and where it buried its dead truths. This was not resilience. This was preparation. Elizabeth bought her freedom in 1855. That sentence sounds clean. It is not. Freedom required payment not only in money, but in memory. To survive as a free black woman in Washington was to learn when not to remember, to speak carefully, to forget publicly, to endure privately. She opened a dressmaking business. Her reputation grew quickly, not because she flattered her clients, but because she made them feel understood, seen, safe. That was the danger. Women spoke to her as if she were furniture, as if she could not testify. They confessed things, not sins, logistics. One client whispered about deliveries made at night to a religious boarding home. Another asked for mourning dresses in advance, before deaths were announced. A senator's wife demanded bloodstains removed without questions. Elizabeth asked none. She stitched. In 1861, she was summoned to the White House. Mary Todd Lincoln was known for volatility, grief, and excess. But what disturbed Elizabeth was not her instability. It was her fear, a fear not of assassination, but of exposure. The White House was crowded with rooms no one toured. Locked cabinets. Corridors renamed after renovations erased their purpose. And beneath it all, tunnels, some documented, others rumored. Elizabeth was given unrestricted access. That alone should trouble historians. She dressed Mary during pregnancy rumors, funerals, and events that never appeared on schedules. She altered gowns after nights when no guests were recorded, but candles had burned down completely. Once, while fitting a black crepe dress, Mary asked Elizabeth, "If a woman witnesses something unspeakable, is silence a sin?" Elizabeth did not answer. She adjusted the hem. From that day forward, she began keeping thread samples she never used. Dark reds, faded browns, colors that matched nothing fashionable. She labeled them only by date. There was a room in the White House Elizabeth was told never to enter. It had no windows, no designation, no official record, but it had a key. One night, while Mary Todd Lincoln slept under sedation, laudanum thick in the air, Elizabeth heard movement. Not footsteps, dragging. Instinct overrode obedience. She opened the door. What she saw was not a crime scene. It was worse. A chapel-like space, stripped of symbols. No cross, no flag, only benches worn smooth by years of kneeling. On the far wall, shelves stacked with ledgers. Names, dates, ages, children's ages. There were dresses there, small ones, some unfinished, some stained. Elizabeth understood immediately. This was not a place of worship. It was a place of processing. She closed the door without sound. From that night on, she began sewing messages into garments. Tiny, almost invisible phrases hidden in seam allowances. Biblical verses altered by a single word. Dates inverted. Initials reversed. Not confessions. Coordinates. After the assassination, she burned nothing. She packed. When questioned later about why she wrote a memoir exposing Mary Lincoln's instability, scholars assumed bitterness. They were wrong. Elizabeth Keckley published what she was allowed to say, to distract from what she never wrote. Her silence was not loyalty. It was containment. Because some secrets, once named, do not stay buried. They spread. And she had already seen what America did to children it could not explain. After Lincoln's death, Washington, D.C. entered a period of ritualized mourning. Black crepe draped buildings. Sermons rehearsed grief. History was already being shaped, smoothed, simplified. Elizabeth Keckley watched quietly. What few noticed was that several church basements were quietly emptied during this time. Crates removed at night. Documents relocated for safekeeping. Officially, these were financial records. Unofficially, they were something else. Elizabeth knew because she had seen the ledgers. They were not lists of donations. They were inventories of children transferred between institutions under religious authority. Orphanages, seminaries, charitable homes. Each transfer justified with scripture. Each absence explained as God's will. What chilled her was the handwriting. The same hand appeared across decades, across denominations, as if the institution itself had learned to write. Some names were crossed out, others circled. Besides certain entries, symbols were marked, not crosses, not stars. Something older, something geometric. Elizabeth never copied the ledgers. She memorized them. As a former slave, she understood the danger of possessing proof. Memory was safer. Memory could be denied. But memory also rots. At night, she dreamed of pages turning themselves, of children aging backward, of hymns sung with no mouths. She began attending funerals she was not invited to, especially those of children, especially those without families. She stood at a distance, watching who attended. The same men appeared repeatedly. Ministers, trustees, guardians. They never cried. Elizabeth noticed something else. Many of the mourning dresses she was asked to make for children were adult-sized, then altered smaller, as if the size of loss had been decided before the body. She kept the scraps. Always the scraps. Elizabeth was not alone. By the late 1860s, she had quietly become part of a network. Black women employed in laundries, tailoring rooms, boarding houses. Women invisible by design. Women who heard everything. They did not speak openly. They spoke in measurements. 7 inches too long meant a child sent away. Buttons missing meant records altered. Black thread requested meant death was expected. Elizabeth never organized them. That would have been dangerous. Instead, she listened. One woman claimed she was asked to wash altar cloths soaked in something thicker than wine. Another altered choir robes for boys who never sang again. There were patterns. Churches closest to rail lines reported more orphans. Seminaries with private cemeteries reported fewer burials than admissions. And always, the same justification: God provides. Elizabeth understood the genius of it. Slavery had been public, brutal, visible. This was cleaner. A system where morality disguised logistics. Where scripture replaced chains. Where disappearance could be called salvation. The women spoke of a place, not a building, but a process, referred to only as the passage. Children entered one institution and emerged renamed, reassigned, or not at all. Elizabeth never asked what happened at the end. She already knew. Some answers announced themselves by the silence around them. In 1868, Elizabeth Keckley published her memoir. The reaction was immediate and vicious. She was accused of betrayal, of exploiting Mary Lincoln's grief, of overstepping her place. Former allies withdrew. Clients vanished. Historians have long puzzled over why Elizabeth would risk everything by publishing it all. They assume emotional impulse. They are wrong. The memoir was not confession. It was camouflage. By framing herself as indiscreet, she redirected attention. Scholars debated her loyalty. Journalists mocked her ambition. Clergy condemned her impropriety. No one asked what she left out. The memoir contains gaps, years condensed into sentences, events referenced without detail, names deliberately misspelled, dates shifted by months. To a casual reader, these are errors. To someone trained in concealment, they are markers. Elizabeth was not defending herself. She was buying time. After publication, surveillance eased. People dismissed her as reckless, not dangerous. Her correspondence was no longer monitored with the same care. And that is when she began moving items. Small things. Innocent things. A scrap of lace mailed to Philadelphia. A lining sent to Boston. A child's glove folded into a hymn book donated to a rural church. Each carried something hidden. Not proof. Warnings. In her later years, Elizabeth was plagued by a recurring dream. She stood in a chapel with no altar. Children sat in pews, facing backward. Their faces were blurred, but their hands were stitched together with red thread. A bell rang. Each time it rang, a name was erased from the air. She woke with her fingers cramped, as if gripping a needle. Neighbors reported she slept with lights on, that she spoke to no one after dark, that she refused charity from churches. Once, a minister asked why she never returned to worship. Elizabeth replied softly, "Because I know what waits in the rooms beneath the hymn." She died in 1907. No pastor presided. No church claimed her. After her burial, the trunk was opened. Inside were dresses that did not match any known client, sizes that fit no body, seams unpicked and re-sewn repeatedly, as if correcting mistakes that could not be named. And at the bottom, a list. Not names. Dates. All ending the same year. 1871. The year the ledgers disappeared. 1871 does not stand out in textbooks. No war began. No president died. No revolution announced itself. And yet, in Washington, D.C., entire institutions vanished. 3 orphanages closed within 6 months, not from scandal, not from poverty, but from restructuring. Their buildings were sold to shell organizations, then demolished. Records were transferred, then misplaced. Church minutes from that year show an anomaly. Long stretches of missing entries, replaced by identical phrases written in different ink. Meeting adjourned due to unforeseen circumstances. Elizabeth noticed something else. Several men who had appeared repeatedly at children's funerals, trustees, clergy, benefactors, stopped appearing altogether. Not because they died, because they changed names. Census rolls from 1870 to 1880 reveal men with identical ages, identical handwriting, identical spouses, but different identities. They moved west, south, across state lines. Rebirth without confession. Elizabeth understood the pattern because she had lived it. Slavery had taught her how institutions erase themselves, not by denying crimes, but by relocating them. In 1871, she stopped accepting new clients. This was unthinkable for a woman who relied on sewing to survive. But she had seen something that convinced her no garment could protect her anymore. A letter arrived that year, and signed, unstamped, containing only a strip of cloth. Children's muslin. Stained. Pinned to it was a phrase, written backward. "You remember too much." She burned the letter. She kept the cloth. One orphanage stood longer than the others. St. Anselm's Home for Wayward Youth. Publicly, it was converted into a preparatory school. Privately, it continued its work under a new theology: discipline, correction, salvation through labor. Elizabeth walked past it one afternoon and saw a familiar girl through the iron gate. Same posture, same scar at the temple, different name. The girl did not recognize her. That was the point. Elizabeth later learned that St. Anselm's introduced a cleansing doctrine. Children were encouraged to renounce previous identities as sinful. Birth names were replaced. Memories discouraged. Confession reframed as disobedience. Trauma became theology. Elizabeth attended one open sermon. The minister spoke calmly about necessary forgetting, about how God sometimes required the erasure of self to preserve order. The congregation nodded. Elizabeth left before communion. That night, she unpicked a dress she had sewn years earlier, a child's morning gown. Inside the lining, she found something she did not remember placing there. A symbol, the same geometric mark she had seen in the ledgers. She realized then the truth she had avoided. She had not merely observed the system. She had been used by it. Her access, her silence, her labor. She was part of the mechanism. And mechanisms do not forgive awareness. In her final decades, Elizabeth lived quietly. Too quietly. Neighbors noticed men visiting her home at dusk. Always polite. Always well-dressed. Always leaving empty-handed. She never acknowledged them. One neighbor overheard a conversation through the thin walls. A man said, "You have no proof." Elizabeth replied, "I have time." After that, the visit stopped. But the pressure did not. Her pension was delayed. Charitable requests denied. Invitations withdrawn. Churches that once praised her now ignored her entirely. This was not punishment. It was containment. Elizabeth understood the language of systems. She had survived one of the most brutal in American history. This one was subtler. It did not whip. It waited. She began to destroy her own work, burning patterns, unraveling dresses, scattering thread into the river. But some things cannot be undone. She wrote letters she never sent. She labeled packages she never mailed. She prepared for a moment she knew would not come in her lifetime. Because institutions do not fear truth. They fear inheritance. Elizabeth Keckley died with her mouth closed. No final statement. No confession. No accusation. That, historians say, is proof that there was nothing more to tell. They misunderstand her entirely. Elizabeth did not believe in confession. Confession absolves the listener. She believed in residue. In what remains after denial. The trunk she left behind was not meant to be read like a diary. It was meant to be discovered slowly. Misunderstood. Dismissed. Until patterns emerged. Until someone noticed the dates. The symbols. The unfinished seams. Until someone asked why a woman who had survived slavery, rape, and poverty feared churches more than death. Until someone understood that silence can be a form of resistance, when speech would only feed the machine. Elizabeth Keckley did not expose the system. She outlived it, and she left behind enough fragments to ensure it could never fully bury itself again. Because some horrors do not end. They change uniforms. Long after Elizabeth Keckley's death, fragments began to surface. Not testimonies. Not accusations. Memories without owners. In the early 20th century, social workers recorded strange interviews with elderly men and women who had grown up in religious institutions. Their stories were inconsistent, disjointed, and eerily similar. They spoke of being renamed multiple times, learning hymns before learning their own birthdays, being punished for remembering their mothers, rooms beneath chapels where time felt different. Many could not explain how they knew these things. They only knew they were not supposed to say them. Doctors labeled it confusion. Clergy called it spiritual struggle. Historians ignored it. But one pattern stood out. A disproportionate number of these individuals had passed through Washington, D.C. between 1860 and 1875, and many described a woman they remembered only by touch. Hands adjusting collars. Fingers steady, gentle. A voice that never asked questions, but always paused, as if listening for something deeper. None knew her name. They only remembered feeling seen. Elizabeth Keckley had left no children behind, but she had left witnesses. By the 1920s, Elizabeth Keckley's legacy had been reduced. Textbooks framed her narrowly. A dressmaker, a companion, a minor historical footnote. Her memoir was dismissed as gossip, her warnings reframed as social missteps, her isolation explained as poverty. This was not accidental. Historical committees quietly debated whether her writings should be reprinted. Church archives restricted access to documents from her era. A proposed memorial was delayed indefinitely, then abandoned. Not erased, softened. Because erasure draws attention, minimization does not. Elizabeth became important, but not dangerous. And that was exactly how the system preferred her. Meanwhile, buildings connected to the orphan network were renovated, repurposed, renamed. Basements filled in. Records reclassified. The passage did not end. It evolved. Elizabeth had anticipated this. That is why she did not leave a single narrative. She left contradictions. Contradictions force investigation. In the 1940s, a historian cataloging private church collections noticed something odd. A recurring symbol, geometric, unlabeled, appearing in margin notes, stitching patterns, donation tallies. It meant nothing on its own, until it was compared to the lining of a preserved 19th-century dress. The stitches matched. Same angles, same spacing. The historian closed the file. He did not publish, but he circled one name in his notes. E. Keckley. Later that year, the file disappeared. The dress did not. It remains today, cataloged, neutralized, stripped of context. But the symbol is still there, waiting. Elizabeth Keckley understood something most reformers never do. You cannot destroy a system built on moral certainty by confronting it. You must outlast it. You must become uninteresting. You must let it believe it has won. And then, you leave behind fragments it cannot fully erase without revealing itself. Elizabeth did not save everyone. She never claimed to. She did something quieter. She preserved truth long enough for it to leak. Into dreams. Into archives. Into seams. That is why her story feels unfinished. Because it is. The trunk was opened decades after Elizabeth Keckley's death. Not by family. Not by historians. By accident. A storage clerk cataloging forgotten possessions noticed the weight was wrong. Too heavy for fabric. Too balanced to be random. Inside were dresses wrapped in plain linen, not labeled by owner, but by sequence. Numbers stitched into inner seams. Not sizes. Not years. Order. Some garments showed signs of repeated alteration. Hems raised, lowered, raised again. Sleeves lengthened, then shortened. As if the bodies they were meant for had changed, disappeared, returned in memory. At the bottom lay the unfinished piece. A half-sewn lining. Red thread still attached to the needle. No blood. No tear. Just interruption. Elizabeth had not finished because finishing would have meant conclusion. And she did not believe in endings. Hidden within the trunk's false base was a narrow wooden panel. No lock. No label. Behind it, folded paper fragments, deliberately incomplete. Dates without events. Initials without names. Scripture verses altered by one word. Not evidence. A map of absences. The clerk reported the discovery. The fragments were separated. The trunk was reclassified. The panel was lost. Textile experts later examined the final garment. They found something disturbing. The stitch Elizabeth used did not match any known pattern from the period. It was functional, but inefficient. Strong, but slow. A stitch designed not for speed, but for time. It resisted unraveling. It resisted decay. It was meant to be found intact. Elizabeth had embedded meaning into method. The seam itself was a message. This cannot be undone without effort. That was her warning. Because what had been done to the children could not be undone quickly either. Institutions had renamed them. Faith had disciplined them. History had forgotten them. But memory does not require permission. It only requires survival. Elizabeth Keckley is remembered today as a footnote. A dressmaker. A freed slave. A companion to power. That framing is comfortable. It allows distance. What is uncomfortable is the possibility that she stood at the intersection of three forces America still struggles to confront. Moral authority without accountability. Care systems that punish remembrance. Silence mistaken for consent. Elizabeth did not scream. She endured. And endurance, when informed, becomes strategy. She understood that speaking too clearly would result in dismissal. That accusations would be reframed as instability. That truth spoken too early is buried with the speaker. So she chose another path. She waited. There is a belief among archivists that some objects retain intention. not energy. Intention. Elizabeth Keckley's unfinished seam is one of them. It is not meant to accuse. It is meant to ask, why were children moved without record? Why did churches erase before they healed? Why does history soften what it cannot justify? Elizabeth did not give answers. She gave responsibility. Because once something is noticed, it cannot be unseen. And once unseen things are recognized, the system that hid them loses its most powerful weapon: silence. Elizabeth Keckley kept her secrets for 50 years. Not to protect the past, but to test the future. The question is no longer what she knew. The question is, what will we do now that we can no longer pretend not to see it?